Barbara is one of the founders of Formal Semantics, and it's really exciting to have a chance to hear from her. She's currently the Distinguished University Professor of Linguistics and Philosophy Emerita at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And no worries. So maybe that's why she could find the time to come up here. And she's been at Amherst quite a long time. Before that, she was at UCLA.
Wait. We call it UMass.
UMass.
Amherst. Amherst is Amherst College.
Oh, right, UMass.
So we call it UMass.
UMass. Not UMass Amherst? Just
Well, that's the full name, but yeah, right.
All right, thank you. Just to give you a sense of the odd kind of routes that people can take to get to cognitive science, she started out with a BA in mathematics at Swarthmore College, and she also minored in Russian and philosophy. And then she got her PhD in linguistics at MIT with Noam Chomsky as her thesis advisor. And she went on in her career to pioneer formal semantics. And I will just read how she discusses her own principal research interests. She says, formal semantics and its connections with syntax, pragmatics, logics, related issues in philosophy of language and cognitive science. Philosophical interests include the relation between model theoretic and psychologistic approaches to the foundations of semantics, and more generally on various logic-oriented and linguistics-oriented approaches to issues in natural language, semantics, and problems of compositionality. My class will be hearing about compositionality in the course of the term, as well as on Friday. And she's currently working on a book on the history of formal semantics for Oxford University Press. And I will turn things over to her, but let's give her a warm welcome. Oh, and after the talk, please feel free to join us for a reception, so stick around if you can.
Thank you, Adina. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I've only been at Dartmouth once before, if ever. I'm not sure if I've ever been here before. So I'm delighted to be here. So Adina told you what I'm going to talk about. This is related to this project of mine of writing a book on the history of formal semantics. It's taking me forever, but it's a lot of fun to work on. So formal semantics and formal pragmatics, as they've developed over the last 50 years or so, have been shaped by linguists, philosophers, and logicians, affected by developments in linguistics, philosophy, cognitive science, also computational linguistics. So as part of my project on the history of formal semantics, today I'm going to emphasize aspects of that history that concern the relation between language and logic, excuse me, including the vexing question of whether meanings are in the head. There have been centuries of study of logic and language, and until the late 19th century, the disciplines of logic, psychology, and linguistics were not even yet separated. And issues of logic, thought, and language were often discussed together and closely intertwined. Today I'll trace some of the histories of these issues, including the history of claims that, quote, natural language has no logic, and how joint work of linguists, logicians, and philosophers have taken that claim from being what was probably once a majority opinion to now, thank goodness, a minority opinion. So semantics can mean a lot of different things. Traditionally, it meant quite different things to linguists, philosophers, and psychologists because different fields have different central concerns and different methodologies. Philosophers have long been concerned with truth and reference, with logic, with compositionality. I'll say much more about what that means in a minute, with how meaning is connected with thought, and with the analysis of philosophically important terms. Linguists, influenced by Chomsky, care about what's in the head, what's the unconscious knowledge of the native speaker of a language, and how it's acquired. Psychologists have experimentally studied concept discrimination, concept acquisition, emphasis in meaning for psychologists most often at the lexical level, words and concepts. Syntax has influenced linguists' notions of what logical form should mean. if you talk to linguists and you talk about structure of meaning, the first thing that comes into a linguist's head is some kind of a tree structure, very, very much influenced by syntactic tree structures. Logicians build formal systems with axioms and model theoretic interpretation. And when you talk about logical structure to a logician, that suggests referential patterns, patterns of inference or algebraic structure. So very different notions. Formal semantics has its roots in several disciplines, most importantly logic, philosophy, and linguistics. The most important figure in its history was Richard Montagu, who had a tragically short life from 1930 to 1971, and his seminal works in this field date just from the late 60s and the very beginnings of the 70s, no knowing what he would have done if he had lived longer. There were, of course, many other important contributors. Not all will get their fair treatment today because I just have a short hour or so, just because the story is too long and time is too short. But let me back up very briefly to some prehistory. So semantics, first semantics in linguistics, then a bit on semantics in philosophy. So Chomsky's syntactic structures was 1957. So people kind of take that as a turning point in history of linguistics. In the 19th century, linguistics existed within philology in Europe. That's when the German philologists and other philologists were discovering the roots of Indo-European languages and the family trees that actually had an influence on Darwin in his work. And in the United States, there was some philology, but also a lot of anthropology, because the linguists here were discovering all the Native American languages that looked so completely different from the European languages and from each other. And that got linguistics into a very active field here. In the 20th century, linguistics emerged as a science. Part of the Chomskyan revolution was to view linguistics as a branch of psychology. That was a radical view when he first started saying that. And that really helped make linguistics one of the root points for cognitive science in general. But there were negative attitudes to semantics in American linguistics in the 20th century, partly influenced by logical positivism, and in psychology influenced by behaviorism, that you could only study what you could directly observe. You couldn't study anything going on in the head, and semantics seemed very unobservable. You can see the words, you can see the sounds of a language, you can see the morpheme, you can find the morphemes, you can see the words. But the meanings, they're a little bit mysterious. You know, what meaning has been a constantly difficult problem. So there was neglect of semantics in early American linguistics also because working on Indian languages, the fieldwork tradition says, well, you've got to start with phonetics. You've got to decipher the sounds and then figure out the sound patterns, the phonology, then the morphology, the smallest meaningful units. Then maybe you get a little syntax, and no semantics except in word lists and dictionaries a little bit. Semantics in logic and philosophy of language in the early 20th century was making a lot of progress. Frege, Russell, people I'll talk about in a bit. But that was relatively unknown to most linguists. 1954, the philosopher Yehoshua Bar Hillel, who was a good friend both of Chomsky and of Montagu, wrote an article in Language inviting cooperation between linguists and logicians, arguing that advances in both fields would seem to make the time very ripe for an attempt to combine forces and work on syntax and semantics together. He was arguing against the logicians who thought natural language was just too messy to even try to work on. The logicians were mostly at that time developing their logics to use instead of using ordinary language if you wanted to write things in a logically precise way. And he was appealing to linguists to learn about and make some use of the rich methods that logicians were developing for their formal languages. But the very next year, Chomsky, who was then still a PhD student, wrote a reply in Language basically saying no thank you. He was arguing that the artificial languages studied by logicians, the languages of logic, were so unlike natural languages in their structure that the methods of logicians had no chance of being useful for linguistic theory. Chomsky and Bar Hillel remained good friends, but this was a They put their points of view very clearly in those articles. Bar Hillel didn't totally give up, though, on trying to get the linguists and logicians and philosophers together. In 1967, he wrote a letter to Montagu after he had received one of Montagu's newest papers. He said, "This will doubtless be a considerable contribution to the field, though I remain perfectly convinced that without taking into account the recent achievements in theoretical linguistics, your contribution will remain one-sided." Also in 1967, there was the Third International Congress for Logic, Methodology, and Philosophy of Science, and Bar Hillel organized a symposium in Amsterdam on the role of formal logic in the evaluation of argumentation in natural languages, with Jerry Katz from MIT, with Montagu, with Jaco Hinticke, Max Black, Fritz Stahl, Eric Stanius, John Lyons, Dummett, and others. So he kept trying to get these people to learn from each other, pay attention to each other. But back to our history. So Chomsky, Syntactic Structures, 1957. He concentrated on the native speaker's ability to produce and understand a potentially infinite class of sentences. His conclusion was that linguistic competence must involve some finite description of an infinite class of sentences. His formulation of the goals of linguistic theory to characterize how that happens, how that's possible, and what the characterization of this finite knowledge is like, that revolutionized the field. But he has always been ambivalent about semantics. He's been skeptical about the possibility of including semantics in a formal grammar, and has insisted on what he calls the autonomy of syntax, that you study syntax just using syntactic arguments. You don't look at the semantics to get ideas how you should do the syntax. But on the other hand, he has always held that one test of a good syntactic theory is that it should provide a basis for a good semantics. But then he would say, if only we had any idea how to study semantics. So that's what I was encountering as a student, and I considered semantics a field that was just too fuzzy to even try to think about. Right. He argued early on, for instance, here's a thing where syntax is relevant clearly to semantics. He argued early on that deep structure, the thing that was characteristic in his syntactic theory, reveals semantically relevant structure that you don't see when you just look at the surface form of a sentence. So a sentence like John is easy to please, on the surface, John is the subject, right? And easy is the main part of the predicate. But that doesn't really say that John is easy. What the sentence really says is that for someone to please John is easy. And that for him was the deep structure of the sentence, not for semantic reasons, but just to get all the co-occurrences of the different possible forms that you can put those phrases together in. And quoting from Syntactic Structures, he says, in proposing that syntactic structure can provide a certain insight into problems of meaning and understanding, we have entered onto dangerous ground. So he likes to say his syntax is good for semantics, but he also says beware of semantics. There is no aspect of linguistic study more subject to confusion and more in need of clear and careful formulation than that which deals with the points of connection between syntax and semantics. The real question that should be asked is, how are the syntactic devices available in a given language put to work in the actual use of a language? That's very far away from the contemporary view where semantics is part of the grammar. It's one phonology, syntax, semantics. Nowadays, we see them all on a par. But that certainly was not the view in Chomsky's early work. It was not the training that we who were his students were getting. Katzen Fodor in the early 60s, they had philosophy degrees from Princeton, but they were spending all their time at MIT and working with Chomsky also. They added a semantic component to generative grammar. They thought there ought to be some semantics. And they addressed what they called the projection problem, i.e. compositionality, how to get the meaning of a sentence from the meanings of its parts. Now, to illustrate just in a minimal way, at that time, negation and question formation were transformational rules that would map a positive declarative sentence or simply a declarative sentence into a negative sentence or into a question. They were prime examples of transformations that very seriously changed the meaning of the sentences they applied to, either negating it or turning an assertion into a question. Their idea of computing the meaning on the basis of the whole transformational history or T-marker of a sentence can be seen as aiming in the same direction as what Montagu did later when he said, we're going to do the semantics by looking at the derivation steps of a sentence and building up the meaning on the basis of how we built up the syntactic structure. So a deep structure like the airplanes will fly would turn into a negative sentence by the negation transformation, like the airplanes will not fly. And the T marker for that airplanes will not fly includes the phrase marker for its deep structure plus a graph showing what transformations occurred. And they said, you have to do the semantics, you've got to take all that into account. But their semantics, what it was like, I haven't shown you any of their actual semantic representations. It was very primitive. They had the notion of semantic features, like plus human or plus animate and things like that. And their semantic representations were bundles of features, suitable at best for decompositions of one-place predicates like nouns or adjectives. And all their examples tended to be putting a noun and an adjective together and just taking the features from both of them and putting them together. Quine, 1970, in his Philosophy of Logic, had the sensible statement that logic chases truth up the tree of grammar. Katzen Fodor's position could be characterized as semantic projection rules chase semantic features up the tree of grammar. What they were trying to capture had nothing to do with truth conditions. This is another important thing. What their aims were not like the aims of the logicians or philosophers. They were trying to capture properties like ambiguity, synonymy, semantic anomaly, analyticity, all characterized in terms of how many readings a sentence has, which for them would be how many different semantic representations it would have, or whether two sentences share a reading and things like that. All just in terms of representations, which in turn were these bundles of features. Philosophers' reaction to linguists' semantic representations, most forcefully and clearly articulated by David Lewis, who is really another one of the key figures in the foundations of formal semantics. He wrote in 1970 in his paper General Semantics, but we can know the Marquarese translation, that's what he called these Katzen Fodor representations with their semantic markers. We can know the Marquarese translation of an English sentence without knowing the first thing about the meaning of the English sentence, namely the conditions under which it would be true. Semantics with no treatment of truth conditions is not semantics. And then he also said, translation into Marquarese is at best a substitute for real semantics, relying either on our tacit competence at some future date as speakers of Marquarese, or on our ability to do real semantics, at least for the one language Marquarese. So for him, these representations with no, it's like representation with no interpretation was just empty marks on pieces of paper. But linguists did presuppose tacit competence in Marquarese. This was part of the general Chomskyan picture of universal grammar and linguistic competence. They took that or some kind of representation, they didn't claim they had the best one yet, as something that must be universal and innate. And many linguists still think that way. I mean, they know that in syntax, the languages have different syntaxes, you have to learn that, but there's still a widespread feeling that semantics is universal. I'm not going to get into that issue today, but just say that was how they justified working with these representations, because even if that wasn't yet the best one would be something that we would just know because it's part of our innate endowment as humans. To philosophers and logicians doing formal semantics, the language of Marquarese looked empty because it was uninterpreted. To linguists in 1970, concern with truth looked puzzling. Linguists were trying to figure out mental representations that would underlie our linguistic competence. Actual truth was correctly considered irrelevant, and the notion of truth conditions was not really understood. I'll get to that a little more later too. But when the linguistic relevance of truth conditions finally penetrated later, the very nature of linguistic semantics changed. not just in terms of the tools used, but also in terms of the questions asked and the criteria of adequacy for semantic analyses. So it was a really big change. Took a while to come. Now, there was another theoretically important move that was made by the same Jerry Katz, this time with Paul Postal, in a 1964 book, separable from the Marguerite issue and related to the problem of compositionality, how we get the meaning of the whole from the meaning of the parts. Katz and Postal made an innovation. So morphemes like negation, which earlier were introduced in a transformation, they argued that that morpheme really belonged as part of deep structure of a negative sentence, and that the deep structure of a question would have a Q morpheme as part of it. And they argued that there was independent syntactic evidence for doing that, so that they were still respecting the autonomy of syntax in their argumentation. And then once you did that, then you could get the meaning from deep structure alone. So then a sentence like Mary has not visited Moscow would have a deep structure like neg Mary has visited Moscow. Or a question like has Mary visited Moscow would have a deep structure with a Q in it. Q Mary has visited Moscow. So then you didn't have to look at all the transformations when you're working on the meaning. You could just look at the deep structures, which linguists liked anyway, right? So this led to a really beautiful architecture, which Chomsky laid out in his 1965 classic, Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. Phrase structure rules, the simple basic building blocks, context-free rules, generate deep structures. Deep structure is the input to semantic interpretation. Then transformations will turn these deep structures into surface structure, which is what we actually pronounce. Here's a picture of the same thing. Base rules generate deep structures. Then those deep structures are the input to the semantic component. Transformations map that into surface structure. Surface structure is the input to the phonological component. So meaning and form are connected in this very pretty way. This big change in architecture rested on Katz and Postal's claim that transformations can be meaning preserving. It was an interesting and provocative claim, and even without what philosophers would call any real semantics at its foundation, it led to a lot of interesting debates, because that question of whether the transformations are changing meaning or not, you can look at independent of what you think meanings are. Right? And the architecture of the theory, with syntax mediating between semantics for meaning and phonology for the pronunciation, that was elegant and attractive. Chomsky in Aspects had added to the elegance by combining all of his kernel sentences underlying a sentence into a single deep structure with all the different subordinate clauses all represented in this one deep structure. So during the brief period, maybe 5, less than 10 years, when Aspects held sway, there was a rosy optimism. I remember because 65 was when I got my PhD. And it was a really optimistic period. Oh boy, the form of syntactic theory, now we understand the form of the theory. Now our job is just to go out and look at different languages and find out what the substantive universals are and how languages can differ, because we've got the theory down. Right. That was yes. It didn't last very long. I call it the Garden of Eden period. So in that period, roughly the mid-60s, I think generative grammarians generally believed that Katzen Postal hypothesis, that transformations do not change meaning. And the idea that meaning was determined at the deep level was undoubtedly part of the broad appeal of that Chomskyan notion of deep structure. Beyond linguistics, Leonard Bernstein's Norton lectures from around that time, The Unanswered Question, talk about deep structure in music and how it gets transformed into the various things that you actually hear. And it contributed to the aura surrounding the notion of language as a window on the mind. So around 1965, there was this very widespread optimism about the Katz-Postal hypothesis that semantic interpretation is determined by deep structure, and the syntax-semantics interface was believed to be relatively straightforward, even without having any very good idea about the nature of syntax, of semantics. So what upset that lovely view? What led to expulsion from the Garden of Eden? Well, this is an oversimplification, but it's a good representative kernel of what happened. Linguists discovered quantifiers. Linguists discovered words like every and all and some, which hadn't been thought about before. All the examples before had John and Mary as the noun phrases, and there were lots of transformations, which if you apply them to sentences with names, they don't change the meaning. So, for instance, the deep structure for John wants to win was John wants John to win. Fine, that's fine. That's nice. But if there's a quantifier there, you would be saying that the deep structure for everyone wants to win, if it's by identical noun phrase deletion, the deep structure must have been everyone wants everyone to win. And that does not have the same meaning at all, right? I mean, one is selfish, the other is altruistic, right? So this and lots of similar problems led to the well-known linguistic wars between generative semantics and interpretive semantics. Slightly caricaturing, we can say generative semantics put logical form first, insisting on having deepest structures which would be semantically interpretable, whereas the interpretive semanticists put linguistic form or syntax first, insisting on the autonomous syntax without too much change in it, and being willing to complicate the semantic rules however we had to account for these sentences with quantifiers and such. Okay, so this led to battles in the late 60s and early 70s. So let's leave these battles raging for a while and turn to philosophy and logic for a little bit. So the relevant history in philosophy goes back at least to Aristotle, but I'm not going to try to do all that, right? So I'll just start with brief mentions of a few key people and then get into the 20th century quickly. So the history of formally oriented approach toward philosophy of language goes back at least to Descartes and Leibniz. Descartes, like the medieval speculative grammarians, believed that underlying all speech there exists a lingua universalis, representing the form of human reason. And Leibniz agreed with that and had ambitious ideas about how it could be described and put to scientific use. Leibniz called the general framework for such a universal language a characteristica universalis, based on an ars combinatoria, a system of symbolization where you would have simple forms for simple concepts and definite rules for putting concepts together. And unambiguous logical forms displaying the logical structures of all complex expressions built from multiple concepts. And together, that should provide a logical analysis of all the actual and possible concepts that might arise in science. And then the framework should include a calculus ratiocinator. I don't pronounce Latin right, sorry. A complete system of deduction that would allow new knowledge to be derived from old knowledge. So you just represent things in this beautiful, unambiguous language with simple symbols for simple concepts. Apply this calculus to it, and you get all kinds of new knowledge from there. Wouldn't that be wonderful? My colleague Angelika Kratzer often teaches a very popular undergraduate course called The Dream of a Perfect Language, talking about all the attempts through history to try to design something that would have these kinds of features. In the 19th century, George Boole had an algebraic conception for his system governing what he called the laws of thought, a calculus ratiocinator independent from the vagaries of natural language. Boolean algebra turns out to have widespread application to natural language semantics, whether Boole would like that or not. But the greatest foundational figure for formal semantics is Frege. His crucial ideas include the idea that the way a lot of meanings get put together, the core of compositionality, is function-argument structures. That some expressions are interpreted as functions, other expressions are interpreted as things that can be their arguments, and as you climb up the syntactic tree, you're constantly applying functions to arguments, getting the new results, which will either be new functions or they can be new arguments to other things. And he's credited with the principle of compositionality, which I keep referring to and finally better say, right? The meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of its parts and of the way they are syntactically combined. The emphasis on syntax came later when the linguists got involved. But it's the basic Fregean idea. And Frege introduced the distinction between sense and reference, or Sinn and Bedeutung, which philosophers and semanticists have been trying to formalize adequately ever since. One of Frege's great contributions was the logical structure of quantified sentences. Aristotle had done things with quantified sentences, but never more than one quantifier in a sentence. So Aristotle has all these syllogisms with all men are mortal, etc., but nothing with every man loves some woman. That didn't enter Aristotelian logic at all. And Frege, centuries later, corrected that defect. Aristotle was so great that everybody just took Aristotle as a Bible. And it took a renegade like Frege to say, wait, we really need more, right? So that was part of the design of a concept script, or Begriffsschrift, a logically perfect language to satisfy Leibniz's goals. He didn't see himself as offering an analysis of natural language, although we looked to him for a lot of help with that. He was seeing himself as offering a tool to augment natural language, like the microscope augments the eye. He was very respectful of natural languages, just like the inventor of the microscope is very respectful of what the eye can do. But for some purposes, the microscope does better. For some purposes, Frege's logical language can do better. Frege also figured out a systematic semantics for variable binding, more compositionally than what Tarski did 50 years later. He rejected the psychologism of many of his predecessors, so these interesting arguments about the foundations of semantics and logic arise already back then, exemplified, for instance, by John Stuart Mill. Mill said logic is a branch of psychology. Nobody now says that, but he had very powerful influence in the 19th century. He said, so far as it's a science at all, it's a part or branch of psychology, differing from it on the one hand as the part differs from the whole, and on the other as an art differs from a science. He considered psychology a science, logic an art. Its theoretical grounds are wholly borrowed from psychology and include as much of that science as is required to justify its rules of art. So logic back then really meant how to avoid fallacies and this and that. It wasn't what you study in a formal logic class now. But Frege had as one of his main theses that mathematics and logic are not part of psychology, and that the objects and laws of mathematics and philosophy are not defined, illuminated, proven true, or explained by psychological observations and results. One of Frege's central arguments is the consideration that whereas mathematics is the most exact of all sciences, psychology is imprecise and vague. Frege claims that in the realm of logic, we do find both descriptive and prescriptive laws, but the former, the descriptive laws, are the foundation for the prescriptive ones. As he says, every law that states what is can be apprehended as prescribing that one ought to think according to it. This holds of geometrical and physical laws no less than logical laws. So Frege's main criticism of psychological logic is that it conflates true and being thought to be true. So that was fun. So some key 20th century developments in logic and semantics. Bertrand Russell was one of the great forerunners. He introduced logical types to avoid paradox and made many foundational contributions to the logical analysis of natural language, but more with the aim of replacing natural language by a logical language in formal argumentation. So you see this over and over in Leibniz and Frege and Russell. You study natural language, you analyze how certain things work, then you try to design an artificial language that will do that more unambiguously and clearly and precisely. Early Carnap used Russell's theory of types syntactically for the grand project of the logical construction of the world and the logical construction of language. But later Carnap developed a semantic approach where meaning equals truth conditions, an idea he got from Wittgenstein. Carnap introduced possible worlds into semantics as state descriptions and analyzed intensions as functions from possible worlds to extensions. If I don't have time to say any more about that, you're welcome to ask questions about any of these things that I say too briefly. Right. Tarski then developed model theory based in set theory, and with it made major advances in providing a semantics for logical languages like first-order predicate logic and modal logic, including his semantical definition of truth. Around this time, a war began within philosophy of language. So the linguists had one war, the philosophers had a different one. the ordinary language versus formal language war. Ordinary language philosophers rejected the formal approach, urged attention to ordinary language and its uses. This includes late Wittgenstein, Strawson, and a number of other philosophers, mostly British. Strawson, in On Referring, 1950, he's reacting to Russell's great paper on denoting, which had Russell's theory of definite descriptions. Strawson says, the actual unique reference made by a definite description, if any, is a matter of the particular use in the particular context. Neither Aristotelian nor Russellian rules give the exact logic of any expression of ordinary language, for ordinary language has no exact logic. Russell, 1957, in Mr. Strawson on Referring. I may say, to begin with, that I am totally unable to see any validity whatever in any of Mr. Strawson's arguments. But then, toward the end of the article, I agree, however, with Mr. Strawson's statement that ordinary language has no logic. So both sides in this war, and like Chomsky as well later, were in agreement that logical methods of formal language analysis do not apply to natural language. In some quarters that war continues, but the interesting response of some formally oriented philosophers was to try to analyze ordinary language better, including its context-dependent features, which were part of what it sometimes seemed to make it seem illogical. The generation that included Arthur Pryor, who did great work on tense logic, Bar Hillel, who did a lot of work on demonstratives, Reichenbach, who did work on tense and aspect, Haskell Curry, and Montagu, gradually became more optimistic about being able to formalize the crucial aspects of natural language. So Montagu was a student of Tarski's, and he was an important contributor to all of these developments. His higher order typed intentional logic unified tense logic and modal logic, and more generally unified formal pragmatics with intentional logic. He gave an analysis for the words like I and you in terms of their context dependence, along with the semantics of the words that are not context dependent, and all of it compositionally. Montagu treated both possible worlds and moments of time as components of what he called indices, and treated intensions as functions from indices to extensions, so generalizing from what Carnap had done. The strategy of adding more indices as you find more things that the reference of an expression of natural language depends on came from Dana Scott's paper, Advice on Modal Logic. And Montagu also generalized the intentional notions of property, proposition, individual concept, etc., into a typed intentional logic, extending Carnap, Church, and Kaplan, putting together Frege's function argument structure with the treatment of intensions as functions to extensions. So all kinds of syntactic categories had expressions which had an extension which tells what they pick out in the actual world or at some particular time and possible world, and they had an intension which is closer to capturing the meaning, what they would pick out in any possible world at a given time. In pragmatics and intentional logic, Montagu distinguished between possible worlds and possible contexts, something that had not been clarified earlier, and applied his logic to the analysis of a range of philosophically important notions like events or obligations. This was just as he started working on the analysis of natural language a little bit. That work, like most of what preceded it, Montagu still followed the tradition of not trying to formalize the relation between natural language constructions and the logico-semantic analyses that the philosopher logician was giving to them. The philosopher-analyst served as a bilingual speaker of both English and the formal language used for analysis. And the goal was not to analyze natural language, but to develop a better formal language that would have all the best properties of natural language, to be as rich as natural language, but more precise, and one that you could work with formally to derive only valid inferences. Montagu, in an article in Stahl, 1969, that comes from that conference that Bar Hillel organized, continued to maintain that this goal of developing a better formal language was more important than the goal of analyzing natural language. I don't know if he still believed that at his death, but he was putting more and more of his effort into analyzing natural language, at least. So a lot of us wondered for a long time, why did Montagu, who had been doing logical work and work in recursive function theory, foundations of set theory, the kind of work the logicians typically do, why did he start working on analyzing natural language explicitly? And I've been doing some of my research has taken me to the Montagu archives at the UCLA library, and there I found a new clue. So there was a handout there from a talk he gave in Vancouver, one of his earliest talks on his work on English as a formal language, and there was a page that was not part of the handout on just a yellow sheet of paper, the sort of thing that means this is what I'm going to say before I start the actual talk. And partly it was in shorthand. Montagu used shorthand a lot, so I had to work to figure out what it said on that piece of paper, but I think I've got it right. He said, "This talk is the result of two annoyances. One, the distinction that some philosophers, especially in England, draw between formal and informal languages. And the other, the great sound and fury that nowadays issues from MIT," that means Chomsky, right? "Under the label of mathematical linguistics or the new grammar. A clamor not to the best of my knowledge accompanied by any accomplishments." When I first was trying to decipher, I thought it said not by many accomplishments, but as I got better, I thought, no, it really says any, right? This is still Montagu continuing. "I therefore sat down one day and proceeded to do something that I previously regarded and continue to regard as both rather easy and not very important. That is, to analyze ordinary language." Imagine how that hit me in the pit of my stomach. I'm a lifelong linguist to see, this is just some little thing. I'm just going to sit down and do it today, right? "I shall, of course, present only a small fragment of English, but I think a rather revealing one." He inserted a note about other creditable work, including traditional grammar, the Polish logician Ajurkiewicz, a pair of computational linguist logicians, Boner and Backer, and his student, Hans Kamp. Later notes, 1970, luckily, suggest he eventually found it not entirely easy. Otherwise, it makes all of us feel like, why does it take us so long to get a good analysis of this or that? Right? His first work on natural language was the provocatively titled English as a Formal Language. He had taught that at UCLA and at the University of Amsterdam in '66. It famously begins, "I reject the contention that an important theoretical difference exists between formal and natural languages. As noted by Emmenbach, the term theoretical here must be understood from a logician's perspective and not from a linguist." What he was denying was the central presupposition of the formal language, ordinary language wars, that there was a mismatch between linguistic form and logical form for natural language. What he was proposing here and in his universal grammar paper was a framework for describing syntax and semantics and the relation between them that he considered compatible with existing practice for formal languages and an improvement on existing practice for the description of natural language. And the Fregean principle of compositionality was central to what he was doing and remains central in formal semantics. For him, the syntax-semantics interface has a very different look than these representations the linguists were playing with. Syntax is an algebra. Semantics is a different algebra. They have different stuff. Syntax has expressions. Semantics, the algebra, is an algebra of meanings of some sort. And compositionality is the requirement that there should be a homomorphism from the syntactic algebra to the semantic algebra. That is a very systematic mapping. The nature of the elements of the syntactic and semantic algebras is left open. So he will let the linguists argue about what the crucial pieces are that make up the syntactic structures. And he'll let the philosophers and linguists and logicians continue to argue about what meanings are. But what he cared about was the structure of them and the relation between them. So the differences between his fancy higher order intentional logic, typed intentional logic, and the first order predicate logic of Russell, which is all that linguists and most philosophers knew and worked with, or maybe extensions to some modal operators. That made a crucial difference in the very possibility of giving a compositional semantics based on a relatively conservative syntax of English. That's where the structures posited look pretty close to the structures that you actually see on the surface. And I'll give at least one illustration of that. So once he had shown what could be done with the use of model theoretic techniques for compositional semantics and with a higher order intentional logic, both the linguistic wars and the philosophy of language wars could be peacefully resolved by removing their presuppositions. That doesn't mean they ended. That doesn't mean that everybody immediately said, oh good, we have this, we can forget all the rest of that. But I was lucky enough to be at UCLA and sitting in on his classes at that time. I mean, I just had very, very good luck with place and time, that I got syntax in Chomsky's first classes at MIT, and then my first job was at UCLA, and there was Montagu, and David Lewis, an old friend of mine, was there to help me understand what Montagu was saying, because if a linguist tries to read Montagu's papers unaided, it's just about impossible. But sitting in on his courses, being able to get David Lewis to answer my stupid questions, like what's a lambda, that helped me understand what Montagu was doing. And this is the way I saw it, was, oh my heavens, if we could do things this way, then we could have some semantics that would not be mushy. It would be serious. We could see what's giving right and wrong answers, and we could really go to town. So details of Montagu's own analyses have in many cases been superseded, but in overall impact, his paper, Proper Treatment of Quantification in Ordinary English, was as profound for semantics as Chomsky's syntactic structures was for syntax. Em and Bach summed up their cumulative innovations by saying, Chomsky's thesis was that English can be described as a formal system. Montagu's thesis was that English can be described as an interpreted formal system, that semantics can be part of the formal description. Truth conditions and entailment relations are basic. These are minimal data that have to be accounted for to reach what Chomsky would have called observational adequacy, the ground level of getting things right. That principle, inherited from logic and model theory, is at the heart of Montagu's semantics and is one of the defining properties of formal semantics. Creswell put it in the form of his most certain principle. We may not know what meanings are, but we know that if two sentences are such that we can imagine a situation in which one of them is true and the other is false, then at least we know those two sentences do not have the same meaning. That seems so trivial, it's hard to appreciate how useful it can be. In just starting from basic observations, you can go a long way if you just respect that principle. And many decisions about semantic analysis, both in general architecture and in particular instances, can be seen to follow from that principle. So the advent of truth conditions and the tools of model theory made semantics an incomparably more powerful discipline than it had been before. It may be hard to realize now how surprising and controversial an idea it was to linguists in the early 70s that we should think about truth conditions rather than just ambiguity, semantic anomaly, synonymy. Okay, so then going on from there. I cannot see my slide number without my glasses. Okay, I need to find some things I can leave out, and I will. Montagu was doing his work on natural language at the height of linguistic wars, though he and the semanticists in linguistics had no awareness of each other then. He didn't work single-handedly. There's lots of other important people. His last paper was delivered at a workshop in Stanford in 1970, fall 1970, and he was murdered in March of 1971. So he had only done a few papers in this area, but they were really rich and deep and became extremely influential. So after his death, we mere mortals had to kind of carry on and try to see what we could do to understand it and do more with it. So I already said I was at UCLA. So I told you that part. After Montagu's death, I worked on understanding his logic and semantics and looking for ways to try to combine Montagu's semantics and Chomsky's syntax. And I had a lot of help from logicians and philosophers in the process. The introduction of Montagu's work to linguists came by some papers I started writing starting in '73, and Rich Thomason, philosopher and logician, who published Montagu's collected works with a long, nice pedagogical introductory chapter in 1974. Two exciting events I don't have time to tell you about, but would be delighted to answer questions about, was a 1971 institute at Irvine in Semantics and Philosophy of Language, and the 1974 Linguistic Institute at UMass Amherst that had lots of semanticists and philosophers of language gathered together. And those things helped give a big push to this kind of later cooperation. So I do want to say a little bit about this foundational issue, the psychologism, anti-psychologism. I mentioned Frege and John Stuart Mill arguing about it. Well, there's a similar tension between Chomsky's view of what we're studying when we're studying linguistics, studying grammar, and Montagu's view, which is much more direct descendant of the Fregean view. The Chomskyan revolution included putting human linguistic competence at the center of study, that what we're studying is what's in the head of the native speaker of a language, and the huge question of what's the endowment we come with that enables children to learn a language. When some of us took on the challenge of combining Montagu's approach to semantics with Chomsky's approach to syntax, technical and substantive progress was rapid and successful. If you don't worry about this psychology, not psychology, you just worry about how do relative clauses combine with nouns? How does the semantics of comparatives work? How do sentences with quantifiers get interpreted? That progressed by leaps and bounds. But there was still, while all the progress went on, there was still this apparent incompatibility about what we were doing. Chomsky's view of linguistics as a branch of psychology and the anti-psychologistic Fregean tradition viewing meanings as abstract objects. In hindsight, what I once saw as a problem, I now see as a good thing, how semantics pushes us actually toward a less narrow view of human competence and psychological reality. That is, we don't have to give up, we don't have to choose between these two things. We can find a better view of competence and psychological reality that just makes them much more compatible than they seemed to be. What should competence and performance mean in semantics? How might that differ from competence and performance in syntax? You know, I don't know if you all know Chomsky's competence-performance distinction. So performance might stop us from being able to produce or understand a sentence that's 1,000 words long. But the grammar generates sentences of unbounded length. So our competence would, according to competence, there's all these infinitely many sentences, and they are what the grammar says they are. And so it's kind of like knowing the rules of multiplication, but you can't just from your head multiply extremely long numbers. But you've got the competence. You just have some limitations of time and memory space and that kind of thing. And how have ideas about what's in the head about what quote in the head means changed from Fodor's methodological solipsism, very much like a brain in the vat is the human competence that we're looking at, prominent in the 70s, in the intervening decades. Putnam famously argued in 75 that meanings ain't in the head. Stalnaker argued in 89 that meanings are in the head, but they're in the head like footprints are in the sand. That's very different from a container and contents, right? And the problem was in taking too narrow a view of in the head, so I expand on that slightly. Semantics is the part of linguistics most affected by these ideas advanced by Stalnaker and then by Tyler Burge about what in the head means. And I now suspect that recent advances in philosophy of mind, which I had not been paying attention to, I was just looking, I would pay some attention to what was going on in philosophy of language, but I wasn't watching philosophy of mind. I think recent advances in philosophy of mind go a long way toward changing the suppositions on which the earlier arguments about psychological reality and competence rested. For Chomsky, competence is defined by the unconscious knowledge of the speaker. If two speakers differ in their internalized syntactic rules, then we say they simply speak different idiolects. They just simply speak slightly different languages. Your language, what your language is determined by these unconscious rules that are in your head. There's no such thing as not knowing the syntactic rules of the language you speak. What you know defines what is the language that you speak. And if you are a master of multiple dialects, then in some sense or other you have multiple systems of rules in your head. Most of us are multi-dialectal, and or multilingual. So this view, shared by many linguists, takes the central goal of linguistic theory to be an account of what the native speaker of a language knows when she knows a language and how that knowledge is acquired. That's part of the view that linguistics is a branch of psychology. Some of the most fundamental difficulties in trying to reconcile the goals of formal semantics and Chomskyan linguistics arise when we try to characterize a notion of semantic competence compatible with both. Because we quickly realize semantics and syntax are quite different in this respect. Well, let me back up and say a little bit. There's no such thing as not knowing the syntactic rules of your language. But if I ask, do you know the meanings of all the words of your language? That's a very different issue. We often depend on experts. There's a lot of division of labor. And we will cooperate, we will speak as long as we approximately have similar enough meanings, we can speak together. And if I use a technical term like electromagnetism, I mean, maybe I slightly knew what it meant when I was a senior in college, but I certainly don't now. I depend on, well, I'm using that word to mean whatever the people who really know about it mean. So we depend in semantics on each other. Our intentions are to be speaking the same language that other people are speaking. And as we acquire words, I don't know if you remember this consciously in acquisition. I remember when I was a graduate student, Chomsky sometimes used to use the phrase ad hoc to characterize certain people's arguments about certain things. And I had never heard that before. And I just gradually, by seeing what he applied it to, gradually picked up, what kind of property of an argument that was supposed to be. And kids are doing this a lot. I mean, things are not so simple as learning dog means dog, especially with the abstract terms. So semantics is different. We've got a lot of words that we use in our language that we do not completely know the meanings of. So we can't really just say that the meanings of everything in our language is just determined by what's in our head in the narrow sense of content. And Putnam was arguing that when he said, so theory of meaning came to rest on two unchallenged assumptions. I'm going to have to stop within 5 minutes. That knowing the meaning of a term is just a matter of being in a certain psychological state. That's the Chomskyan side. And that the meaning of a term in the sense of its intention determines its extension, determines what it applies to or what it's true of, in the sense that same intention determines same extension. And Putnam went on to argue that those two assumptions are not jointly satisfied by any notion, let alone any notion of meaning. He has famous twin earth example where he takes a word like water and says there could be a possible world just like ours where all of our experience and everything in our head is just like it is for us with real water, except on twin earth, that wasn't H2O. That was XYZ. It was a totally different thing. So what we know about the meaning of water does not determine that it's H2O rather than XYZ. There's a lot else that goes into determining what water actually is. So Stalnaker then argued in a 1989 paper that, meanings are in the head. They're in the head like footprints are in the sand. The problem is too narrow a view. A representational system, for Stalnaker, is a system that's capable in being in a range of alternative internal states that tend to be causally dependent on the environment in a systematic way. So the difference between us and the people on Twin Earth is that whatever our internal ideas about water are, they were caused by this stuff that's in this world, namely water. And our Twin Earth counterpart, his impressions, his internal states were caused by XYZ. So the representational states are different because the footprints in the sand, they could be footprints of different creatures. right? And so meanings in the head are representations, but they're representations of, and you just can't leave out the causal connections. Okay, so I won't try to talk about Frege and Chomsky. Yeah, is this the end? Yeah, okay, good. So Chomsky defeated behaviorism and helped to inaugurate the study of cognitive science. And he showed that languages can be analyzed as formal systems, governed by rules and principles that are in the minds of their users as unconscious knowledge. Montagu showed that natural languages can be interpreted as interpreted formal systems. They're not illogical. There was this remaining foundational problem about knowing a language. If we think about it in the wrong way, then it seems like a natural language interpreted as Montagu understood it could not be known by a human being, could not be in the head. But if we follow Stalnaker and Frege in drawing insight from how perception works and how it gives fallible but veridical knowledge prior to any reasoning, we can see semantics as indeed a particularly important and fruitful branch of psychology. It's not narrow psychology in Fodor's old methodological solipsism sense. It's psychology that looks at interaction between environment and the knowing thing, the perceiving subject. So I think that's it. And then I thank lots of people who've helped me learn more about the history of my field and the special collections archivists at UCLA. And I think Adina said the slides will go up later, so if you want some references, there are, oh, that's if you ask me that question. Yeah, if you want some references, there's some references there, and I can readily supply more. Okay.
So we have some time for questions. Do you want me to take questions? Do you want?
Yeah. You have
questions?
some idea who you should call on.
Okay. And I should also say, for my class, I tried to see who was here. I failed to account for everybody, so maybe if you just, I'll leave a piece of paper out, and you can just sign your name.
Oh, you mean they actually get credit?
Yeah, some of
That's
them are
nice.
getting some credit for coming.
So I'm useful.
This is very useful. So anyway, questions? Yes.
Can you explain the difference between generative and interpretive semantics?
Yep. So generative semantics is associated with Lakoff and I have to move. Lakoff, Macaulay, Hadj-Ross, and Paul Postal and others. They said when they discovered the problem, when we all discovered the problem with the quantifiers, they said, oh, so the deep structure for everyone wants to win can't be this everyone wants everyone to win. There's got to be something more like a variable in that second. So you know what it's like in first order logic. For every x, if x is a person, then x wants x to win, something like that. So they made deep structures that looked in some ways like first order logic. They would have just one occurrence of that everyone, and then they would have two noun phrases with variable in them. And then they had a syntactic rule, a bunch of syntactic rules to get from there to surface structure by quantifier lowering, putting the everyone in the position of the subject, and in this case, just deleting the second variable to get to everyone wants to win. And they discovered all kinds of very interesting things. They made a lot of progress, but the syntacticians found their syntax somewhat implausible. And if when we go back and look at what we do now, which has some things in common with that, we could see certain things. They were hobbled by the fact that the only logic they had to work with in making those structures more logical, so to speak, was first order logic. Can I use the blackboard?
Yes.
Will it show up in your pictures? Okay. So here's an example that I like to a very simple example that I just like to show students. So every dog runs, let's say. The way Russell's first order logic would represent that would be for all x, if x is a dog, then the predicate run is true of x, right? So for all x, if x is a dog, then x runs. Now, we look at that now and say, where in that formula is the meaning of every dog? And well, certainly the for all x is part of it. Certainly the dog of x is part of it. This if then is part of it, because if it was some dog runs, you'd put an and in there for some x. For some x, x is a dog and x runs. So if then is part of it. This occurrence of x as an argument of run is part of it, because that's the position that every dog came from. So in first order logic, the meaning of this nice syntactic noun phrase is everything except run. This is part of why Russell thought that natural language was so illogical. You know, Russell said, look what natural languages do. They take every dog and treat it the same way as John. You know, make it a noun phrase. And for Russell, even the king, you know, is something even more complicated looking than the one with every. So Russell thought natural languages were crazy to have John, a man, every man, the man, all in the same syntactic category. And the generative semanticists were sort of stuck in making the deep structures make those different noun phrases look very, very different from one another. So they had a noble goal, but trying to accomplish that goal with first order logic as your only way to make the deep structures have logical forms that would be more semantically transparent was hampered by the big mismatch between first order. I mean, this is the part that was right about Chomsky's reply to Bar Hillel, that the structure of the logical languages just looks very, very different from the structure of any natural language. And oh yeah, I didn't have the slides in here that showed how Montagu solved that. That's right, I forgot that I left that out. For Montagu, he sort of starts by observing this meaning and then says, okay, if we have higher order expressions, we can abstract on this predicate and we can make an expression that says lambda p, you can think of it sort of like the set of all properties p, such that set of all properties p, well, let me first say, he's going to let every dog denote the set of all those properties that every dog has. Right? That's the way he's going to unify all the noun phrases. John is going to become the set of properties all the properties that John has. So this is going to be lambda p. I mean, this is one way of writing. You don't have to use the first order logic at all in writing it. Lambda p for all x. If x is a dog, then p of x. So that this is a constituent in the semantic structure. So now corresponding to the syntactic constituent, every dog, now there's a semantic constituent. It's of a pretty fancy type, sets of properties of individuals. And then this guy is a function. So I said you could think of it as set, but really it's a function that will apply to any property and give you something that has a truth value. So if you apply it to run, let run be its argument. I bet I'm off the camera. Run, yeah. If you apply it to run, then do rules of lambda conversion, you would get back the Russellian statement. Now, this makes it look too much like it's still got first order logic in it. There's ways of representing these things more directly than this way, but this, for people who do know first order logic and don't know Montagu's intentional logic, this is a clear way to represent it. So that's the sense in which what Montagu did helped accomplish the goals of the generative semanticists. And the interpretive semanticists, they were trying to keep the same syntactic structures, but figure out which parts should be interpreted at the level of deep structure and which parts should be interpreted at the level of surface structure, like scope of quantifiers maybe, and what kind of things might have to be interpreted along the way. So the syntax was much cleaner, but the semantics was more complicated. Thank you. I see one in the back corner.
Yes.
I was just curious, why do you think that Montagu underestimated how difficult it would be to analyze natural language?
Say again?
I was just curious, why do you think that Montagu underestimated how difficult it would be to analyze natural language? Where I'm going to do that today. Or
Yeah.
why do you think that is?
That's a nice question. I don't know exactly. I mean, for one thing, I think he thought he was pretty smart. And for another thing, he had already focused on a number of specific problems, and like how to do these quantifiers. And he saw, let me work. Well, for a long time he didn't want to go to higher order logic, but I even found the day on which he decided that's the way he's going to do the quantifier phrases. So he'd solved that problem. He had solved a lot of problems about intensions and extensions, and he thought, well, there's probably a few more problems, to work on, and then I'll have it all. But in the things I found, the papers in the archives from 1970, when he was working on that last proper treatment of quantification problem, one of the things I saw there, for instance, was this paper that was called Proper Treatment of Quantification in Ordinary English. It actually only has 3 different kinds of quantifier phrases, if you can even call them that: every man, the man, and a man. And only those 3 quantifiers. In the notes, he's got lots more. But he ran into the problem of plurals and how plurals, singular and plural, works in English, and when does plural really mean plural and when doesn't it? Like there are these puzzling sentences like unicycles have wheels, which is true. Each unicycle has 1 wheel. So if you say this unicycle has wheels, then has wheels should mean more than 1. But when you say unicycles have wheels, it doesn't mean more than 1. So he noticed a number of, there's lots of problems about plurals. They aren't, plural doesn't just always mean more than 1. In fact, if I say, do you have any children? And you have 1 child, the correct true answer is yes, even though the question says, do you have any children? Right? So there's lots of puzzles about singular and plural. So he noticed them, and I saw that he noticed a lot of puzzles about the determiner any. Hinteke tried to analyze any. Hans Kamp tried to analyze any. It's just at that 1974 Linguistic Institute that I mentioned, we had a workshop with a lot of linguists and a lot of philosophers of language, and I can't remember now which philosopher had a theory of any that he presented, and the linguists just were ready with the examples, because we already knew how hard any was, and so for any different theory of any, we had the crucial example that would show why that theory won't work. So it was. So I think at first he hadn't noticed some of those problems, and I think gradually he did. Hans Kamp worked closely with him through much of this time, and Hans said he had the feeling that Montagu was getting more and more appreciative of the fact that this was non-trivial. I think another part of it was Montagu was a student of Tarski, and Tarski was a very demanding and very exacting professor, and he wanted all his students to do great things. I think he made Montagu revise his dissertation multiple times before he would accept it. Dana Scott left Berkeley because he was not going to submit himself to having to satisfy Tarski. But Tarski was brilliant, but he treated his graduate students sort of like slaves. Well, something between disciples and slaves. They had to help him a lot, and they had to please him with their work. So I think, and Hans Kamp also thinks, that Montagu had internalized this feeling that all that matters is proving non-trivial theorems. You should find some really difficult problems in logic and prove some theorems that mere mortals would not manage to prove, right? And so just to analyze ordinary language, we don't have deep theorems in this work. I mean, there's tough problems, and we try just to get a description is, it's hard. But like what have we got when we've got it? It's not like it's a theorem that can be used to prove more theorems.
I have a question. So along
Yep.
those lines, so we're not done with the problems. You write that in your paper. But do you think that it's just that the groundwork is all there and it's just a matter of sort of working out individual problems?
That would be like
theoretical
that would be like
breakthrough?
that would be like saying we're in a new Garden of Eden, right? Right. I mean,
Yeah, or that it's
no. So the theory,
on the horizon.
the theory keeps undergoing interesting changes. So, for instance, my PhD student Irena Heim did a dissertation on definite and indefinite noun phrases in English, in which this Montagu idea that all noun phrases can be treated in this kind of way, what we call generalized quantifiers, that had been getting lots and lots of mileages. And Irena says, well, no, actually not. Definite noun phrases and indefinite noun phrases, they both just denote variables with certain conditions put on them. And it was a complex theory because it wasn't just changing the denotation, it was changing the meta theory, because she said you can never get it right if you just look at truth conditions of sentences. You've got to go back to something that Stalnaker had done earlier in his work on assertion, that speaker and hearer, you have to think about speaker and hearer communicating with each other, and we share a certain set of presuppositions. We have something like a common ground when we start talking to each other. And if I say something and you accept it, then we update the common ground to include that. And Irena said, that's not only is that right and important, but that's what happens a lot with the use of indefinite and definite noun phrases. I say something like, a cat walked in. Now we update our common ground to include something like, you can think of it as a variable, you can call it a discourse referent, whatever you want to call it, some kind of representation of some entity which is understood to be a cat. It's not denoting any particular cat, but it's there at least locally in the new common ground. And then if somebody else can say, is the cat black? And that a cat means this is a new thing to enter into the common ground. The cat says, oh, you better find a cat in the common ground. And there should be just one salient cat in the common ground. So some noun phrases update the common ground, other noun phrases require that update. So she said the basic semantic values are not truth conditions, but context change potential. And that way of looking, I mean, that's in some ways the beginning of formal pragmatics, or one of the steps in the beginning of formal pragmatics, the interaction of meaning and context. So that was a very big change that changed the way things are looked at. One thing I didn't talk about at all, and it's always a worry, that we still don't have any good theories of, is lexical meaning. What all of this is good for is compositionality. Give me the meanings of the words and the syntactic structure of the sentence, and I'll give you the meaning of the sentence. So all of it is starting from the words as given. I mean, Montagu himself said, working on word meaning is a different kind of job. That's somebody else's job. He just let each word denote some constant of the right type in his logic, and then went from there and building up from there. So he had constants and variables at the bottom of the trees, and then he showed us how to build up the meanings of the whole sentences. But lexical semantics is an interesting, difficult problem, and there's a lot of different approaches to that, and they look totally different from one another. And there's, I mean, there.
A work for philosophers and psychologists, or for linguists?
It's everybody. I mean, this is one of the areas that's really big in computational linguistics now. I should mention, in case there's people interested in computational this and that, computational formal semantics is a big field now. And Google is hiring formal semanticists even. And for a long time I thought Google would never want us because Google just works on co-occurrences of what words occur next to each other. But it turns out you can have all the probabilities in the world. That won't help you to know what to do with a sentence that has a not in it. Right? So you really have to have some of the serious structure as well. But computational linguists do a huge amount with lexical semantics just in terms of looking at huge corpora of language and what words occur together and giving each word a profile in terms of all the other words it occurs with. And you know, our first reaction might be, but that's not meaning. But then I start thinking, well, some of the words we learn, we really do learn in the context of other words. Some words we learn in connection with the world, and some words we learn in terms of what you can say with them. And I don't know how to, I don't know how to say that too clearly, but anyway, so there's looking at how words co-occur. There's lots of psycholinguistic research. There's one line of psycholinguistic research that says we don't have these sharp concepts like all or none conditions, but something like prototypes and resemblance to prototype for some kinds of words. Then that gets argued against by saying, yeah, but we don't know how to do anything compositionally with prototypes. Oh,
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah. What's his name? Michael Connolly?
Andy.
Andy.
Right there.
Andy, that's you. Yeah. Yeah, so the prototype paper, right. So yeah. So there's a lot of different ideas about lexical meaning, but there's nothing that gets you to something, the same sort of abstraction as the things we're talking about here. And I really don't know where it's going to come from. I think it needs linguists and psychologists and computational linguists and philosophers all to work on it. Yeah. I mean, Jerry Fodor believes every word is just a primitive, and you don't try to look inside it at all. But then it's like you have to say what it refers to, and Chomsky's all the same. But that's impossible. He did it for my sake. Okay, what's a sake? And so okay.
Chrissy, do you have a question? Sure.
First time. I have a question just about the history.
Uh-huh.
In the Garden of Eden, what are the Edenites saying about, at that time, demonstratives and indexicals?
Hadn't noticed them.
Okay, it wasn't part of what
In the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden was really syntax, and only this Katzen Fodor kind of semantics, and that was really only semantic features, that are like things that are decompositions of predicates. No, I don't know. In 1965, I mean, I can think back to then. No, demonstratives. No, but no. That the philosophers were worrying about it already. That at that conference that Montagu went to, that Bar Hillel organized, the context dependence was seen as one of the big stumbling blocks. And people said, like, nobody understands demonstratives. And Montagu said, I do. Yeah, and that was 68.
Yeah.
And it hadn't even been published yet. Yeah.
We have time for one last question. Is that a hand? No? Yeah, Tony.
I just had a question about the role of quantifiers and negations in other languages. Have they studied those
Yes.
in other languages as well?
Yes. In fact, I'm happy you asked that because so linguists love to work on typology because that's the way to find out about what's universal and what can vary, which can help answer the question about how much is part of the innate given structure. And not surprisingly, first there was lots of typology for phonology, then for morphology, then for syntax, and for a long time there wasn't much serious work in semantics. But Ammon Bach, Angelika Kratzer, Eloise Jelinek, and I had a project in the late 80s working on quantification across languages. And one of the driving questions was, is this kind of interpretation, treating noun phrases quantificational ones and non-quantificational ones as generalized quantifiers. Is that universal? And it turns out from work that several people did in that time, really in response to our asking the question loudly to the whole linguistic world, some examples were found where the answer is no. And Eloise Jelinek herself studied some Salish languages in the northwest coast and found no, they didn't. And what seems to be more nearly universal is something David Lewis had studied called adverbs of quantification, as in a sentence like, a quadratic equation always has two roots. And that always is not temporal. Right? That's really a way of saying every quadratic equation has two roots. So always, sometimes, usually, those can all be used to quantify over cases of all different sorts, not just over time. And that I don't know if that's absolutely universal because nobody's directly asked that. But the languages that don't have these generalized quantifiers, don't have determiners like every or most, they do tend to have something that is more adverbial, that could be used to express the same kind of things. So yeah. And there's lots of work on negation. I'm sitting in on a seminar at UMass just this semester, worrying about the words that begin with, well, we call them N-words, words like no one, nothing, etc., across different languages. Tremendous variation how they act. I mean, English is in the minority in not liking sentences like nobody said nothing or nobody didn't say nothing. We consider that a substandard dialect. But there's many more languages that do it that way than that do it our way. So the emergence of dialects doing it that way seems to be emergence of a very general, linguistically general property.
Thank you.
Okay, I invite you all to stay and talk and have some food, and if you're 21, have some wine, but we have some other things. And